Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 618. I'm Tom Cagley. Today, process, not just checking the box. The Software Process and Measurement Cast number 618 is a conversation about process that I had with two great people, Mike King and Beth Leonard, back in March 2020. Just doing the process to check the box for a rating or certification, whether that's CMMI, CMMC, Scrum, or any other framework, destroys legitimacy and trust. Mike King is a technology executive with over 17 years of experience serving in technology roles supporting the federal government. He currently serves as Halfaker and Associates Chief Information Officer and Chief Information Security Officer, where he leads enterprise IT strategy with a focus on user experience, the information security program, and the quality management system with a focus on improving engineering maturity and customer experience. Beth Leonard is an award-winning speaker in her field, frequently invited to both local and international level industry events to speak about such topics as customer satisfaction, organizational statistical analysis and metrics development, CMMI, ISO, management reviews, and techniques, as well as quality assurance. She is also a recognized patient advocate and blogger for NET Cancer, neuroendocrine cancer, supporting several organizations both nationally as well as internationally. Are you ready to talk process? It's time for the interview. Beth Leonard, Michael King, welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thanks for having us.
You guys both have been on before, but you've never been on together. And I've been working on sort of putting you together on a show to talk about process. But let's see, it's a new world. I mean, it's probably for all of us, this is the second or third or fourth new world that we've had to deal with as adults. Today, with the two of you, I really wanted to talk a little bit about the role of process, and if there's a role for process in actually effectively delivering value to your customers.
Well, I believe so, yes. Unfortunately, the word process seems to be a dirty word in today's industry. Everybody wants it done faster and less money and less resources, less people. And they think that process will inundate you and make more work than necessary, when in fact, it's the opposite. And getting people to realize that it can take some work.
Yeah. Well, and I think I think a lot of people are attracted to kind of the promise of kind of a lack of process. And so I think anything that kind of gives them a glimmer or a hope of that, of like, oh, I think I heard in my Agile Scrum training, like, we don't have to do any more process or write anything down. It's like, that's not really what you heard. And I think it's easy to kind of get on one side or the other of that, like no process is obviously like awfully dangerous and chaotic. But obviously some organizations, traditionally like 1980s, 1990s, I feel like CMMI has this like bad reputation of just like piles and piles of checklists and procedures. And it's like, well, I can't get any work done. I have to check all these procedures. And I think they're finding that sweet spot is, awfully hard.
Mike, you bring up a good point about Agile. Oftentimes, especially trying to implement standards such as CMMI more from an Agile spin or perspective, marrying the old school CMMI implementation with all the checklists and so forth, and the Agile quote unquote mindset, both on paper as well as in people's minds. People come out of those Agile training sessions like, well, we don't need to have any documented. We don't need to have process. Well, in fact, you are doing process. Literally having a daily stand-up every day, and every week you might have a retrospective. I mean, so that is a process. How documented you have that process could vary, of course. And I think that's the key, is documented versus not.
Sure. Yeah. When all the discipline that comes with kind of like true Agile, I think is hard sometimes, because I think there's like the cool, like, oh no, like the way that we do our stand-ups, the way we do grooming, like that's not process. That's just that's our ritual. That's our routine. It's like, well, that's just, like we're trying to make something that like wasn't cool again, but only in like certain packets. And so I think it's interesting the stigma that sometimes gets attached.
So we have, process is a dirty word. You use the term stigma in there. And I guess some of it is of the industry's making. So I agree, I think, with both of you that if we look back in time, we might find 29 binders for a small, worth of process steps for a small change. And that might sound like hyperbole, but it was pretty close with EDS. And I know because I had a hand in writing those 29 binders worth of stuff. But how do we discern what is really necessary versus what's somebody's opinion of what's necessary?
I think it's, whoever interprets whatever standard or best practice or model that you're implementing, it still comes down to an interpretation of sorts. So I think there is some sort of interpretation, and using the ITIL DIKW, data, information, knowledge, and wisdom, that knowledge component of that, everybody brings something different to the table in terms of interpreting X thing, X requirement, X practice, X clause, whatever it is. And so I think that there is a perspective of interpretation. But at the same time, I think that having the degree, I think having somebody understand what the standard is or whatever that best practice is, along with or combined with some real life experience, gives some backing to what they're saying to the people that they're trying to get to implement said process. So in other words, if I come in here and I just know I just went out of ISO training and I got my ISO auditor, but I've never worked in that topic area, like, for example, service management. And I've never done a service management lifecycle. I've never done IT, et cetera. And I come into an IT organization and I'm saying, oh, you need to follow these practices. And I'm trying to interpret to the letter of the law of what that says in that requirement or that clause of ISO, try to give somebody else direction to do that. I might not be able to think outside of the box and simplify to meet just the base intent of said practice or clause. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
yeah,
my mind.
I think that makes a lot of sense. No, yeah. Well, and I think a lot of times people kind of fail to connect some of those dots, like you're saying, right? So like, how do you have enough kind of context to the industry and the business model that you're inside? Do the different people that are kind of, participating in all of this, process architecture, process design, do they kind of understand the business outcomes that, the company's trying to, pursue? And hopefully that's clearly communicated somewhere of like, what are the SLAs? What are the strategic goals? Like, what are the, the outcomes we're really trying to chase to kind of connect those dots? Because otherwise, I think you can often just see a lot of kind of churn in kind of that process, design, like you're talking about, Tom, where like they go really heavy or they go really light. And it's like, well, what are we trying to accomplish? Like, what is the feedback loop or the OODA loop or kind of how we're trying to like catch that feedback cycle of, is this working? Is this better? And it's kind of like, I don't know, it's like anything else where if you don't have a guiding, set of metrics or a guiding set of principles, there's nothing to adjust to. And instead you just kind of thrash around and try different things. And it becomes a very like anecdotal conversation of like, oh, I wish we had less process, or I wish we had more. It's like, well, what's not working? And what do we want to kind of A/B test around? Do we need a checklist for this, or do we not? Or do we just need to get out of people's way or give them different tools or change the process?
But in my last job, I did it so much differently. It was so much lighter. Why can't we do it that way here?
I was just going to say that I think it comes down to your audience too. I mean, trying to implement process to a developer versus a project manager versus an analyst or a tester or a service desk person or whomever with X amount of experience or lesser or more experience, knowing what's valuable to the individual that you're trying to get to implement or document that process is really critical. What's important to them? How do you speak their language? How do you get them to understand why it's important to implement said process? And then talking to them to obtain the buy-in from them. So if I say, okay, you need to estimate your project, what does estimation mean to them? Does it mean doing something like playing poker with an agile approach to it or story points? Or does it mean I'm doing a entire PERT analysis or something, wideband Delphi or some crazy counting lines of code, God forbid. But I think it's knowing who your audience is and speaking their language and knowing and understanding their level of experience, knowledge, insight, and also how much bandwidth they have, how many resources are available. Are they playing the role of 5 different people, or are there 5 different people playing that same role? So those are things that are critical to being successful in implementing a process.
Yeah, and I think so many people kind of have such a narrow kind of background. I feel like, sometimes people talk about like a T-shaped employee who has kind of broad exposure to a lot of concepts and then has a deep, area or two. And I think if you don't have a pretty broad kind of background and kind of, set of experiences, it's hard to kind of come in and really appreciate, like, who are you optimizing for? Like, are you optimizing for that developer? Are you optimizing for the first line manager or the executive? Like, how do you kind of optimize the whole system, not for one person, and really kind of see all of that? And I think I think because process is often a dirty word, often kind of like things like process, architecture, business capability mapping, like, those all become like this, like those people are in the ivory tower, but like they're not really relevant to real work. And so organizations just don't invest in that. And then they let people kind of all, kind of optimize for their own team, their own kind of lens they're looking at the world, instead of kind of somebody being able to step back and say, hey, like, let's connect these dots. Let's use some UX principles to really understand, like, what do you need and what do you like want to prioritize and what does this person want? And
then the downstream, you kind of touched upon this, is who's your downstream user, client, customer. And there's 2 in my mind, 2 main. It ultimately is your internal customer, which is perhaps your executive, who is directing and saying, hey, we need this process because we need to implement said standard, because we need to be able to win new proposals. But there's also your end client too, that's paying the money and giving you your revenue. And they might have a different perspective, and their value perception is going to be very different from each other. Oftentimes you get the executives, they say that they have buy-in, they're giving you buy-in for implementing these processes or standards. But in reality, you walk down the hallway and you tell them, hey, we're making great progress on CMMI. And anybody who's picked up a CMMI book knows it's about 1.5 inches thick. And if you're implementing CMMI level 5, it's probably the majority of that book that you're implementing. And to be kind of dismissed with, oh, you're just checking the box. It's just checking the box. It's not just checking the box. It's a lot of work. And having the executive leadership understand and respect the individuals who are implementing these types of processes and giving that credit where credit's due, I think is really important. Having the buy-in from that leadership. But again, going back and understanding what their value perception is, what's their ultimate end goal, as well as what is the end goal for their external paying client.
No, I think that's a great point. I think it's interesting to think about kind of the dichotomy between kind of checking the box with some of these process frameworks versus kind of really trying to squeeze the value out. Because I think often people talk about it like, oh no, it's either organizations think of it like very binary of either like, all we want to do is check the box. Like, I don't see this offering us any real business value other than like, go get me that piece of paper. Or there's just this other kind of polar opposite, which is like, yeah, like let's do it for real. And I think sometimes there's a lot of value in kind of seeing that more as a spectrum of like, well, certainly we could spend, 100 years working on tuning all of our processes as we get into like, statistical regression, but what's the right amount of kind of value to squeeze out of this versus, all the other things the business has to invest resources in. And so thinking about kind of that, dial. Another thing that I think is interesting is I think, Beth, you bring up this great point, which is like, how do you think about kind of the people that you're, designing for or optimizing for, right? You've got your internal, kind of executives, you've got your external customers, but I think often it's like tempting, especially for technical people, to kind of be so focused on like the thing that they're making, whether it's, a document or a work product or a process or a piece of software, and not to think about the fact that there's so many different customer, kind of interactions or personas, right? And so like you've got an external customer, you got an internal customer, but like internally, right, you might have like a junior administrative associate versus kind of a first line manager, and kind of understanding what does everybody want. And obviously you can't keep everybody perfectly happy, but how do you make those judgment calls of like, oh, well, the executive would prefer this, but, we have 27 admins who would be, twice as fast if we gave them this feature first. So it's a lot of interesting balancing to do.
Let's do a Pew matrix for that.
Well, maybe, right? Maybe. But I think that really sort of leads me to the question I wanted to ask next. And that is, do either one of you in these kind of process discussions explicitly map out, not the process map, but the value chain that the process is in, so that you know what you're optimizing for? I mean, all value chains within an organization, you may have one, you may have many, but let's say you had one value chain. Isn't there really only one thing to optimize for there?
Oh, go ahead. Beth, did you want to take it?
No, go ahead, Mike.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
I was going to say, is there one thing we're optimizing for? I would say rarely. I mean, certainly I think it's interesting to think about value, which certainly is a good rallying cry and a good central theme to always be asking ourselves. But obviously, value is a pretty vague word. What does that really mean? And what is value? How does value connect to your business outcomes, your SLAs, your strategic goals? And so I think that, very quickly that gets decomposed into a lot of different things. And it's are we trying to emphasize, quality and consistency? Are we trying to optimize for, revenue or, very tactical things? And so I think that the idea of mapping that value flow, I think, is incredibly powerful. And I think it's well worth, like you said, decomposing beyond process mapping, but even decomposing another level down is okay, well, value for who and what kind of value? And are you talking about value for, the shareholders or the customer or the internal employee? Each of those has a very different, kind of lens at how they look at the world.
So understanding who your stakeholders are, right? It's important. And understanding the goals and objectives of each of those stakeholders, understanding what's important to them, what's valuable to them. And, if one of the goals is getting CMMI and they think it's just checking the box, well, let's tie that back to a financial goal or financial impact. So if I got CMMI X for the X company and 5 of the proposals we just won all required us to have that, what's the dollar value for the price tag or revenue, whatever that's associated with that project? And tie that money back to CMMI or the process improvement efforts, because that is the value for them. Now, this whole value stream thing, I don't like this new terminology, to be honest with you. Value. Everybody's using the word value stream. And then they're using it in different manners. And I'm like, what do you actually mean by that?
I'd be happy to go down that path. I mean, but the reality is value stream is 70 years old. It was first actually the whole term and the initial process of what that is, and it's very high level. It was coined by a gentleman named Michael Porter at the University of Chicago in roughly the 1960s. So it isn't new, right? And it isn't new language. But it is a very powerful tool to say, hey, here's when an idea comes in an organization, and here's how we transform it, and here are the things along that line. So that you don't have individuals that in essence optimizing for a small part of a larger flow, which will have no impact on whatever's delivered, right? In value chain, if you were in an automotive organization, value chain is we take raw materials in, we spit cars out the other end, and then we have the dealer networks and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's part of the whole thing. So it's a little different kind of concept. And I think I sort of mentioned, and maybe before we went on the air, that we're all living through another one of those major inflection points in the world. We will not be the same after this COVID thing, because if nothing else, the economy is going to be a tad stressed for a period of time. Is the idea of process and becoming more efficient, do you think that is going to be the next big thing again later in 2020 or early in 2021?
Well, I think that it's going to have a financial impact on our organizations for sure. And we're already strained with the resources we have. Try to keep doing more with either the existing resources you have or with less resources. I think it's going back to the comment about the question about optimization and value stream, I think it's knowing who your stakeholders are to be as efficient as possible, knowing their goals and objectives. And what I like to say is you can't boil the ocean only one pot at a time, really leveraging prioritization of what's critical and mapping the priorities with what the goals and objectives are, and continuously coming back around to that. The CSI approach in ITIL, for example, what's the vision? Where are we at now? Where do we want to be? So on and so forth. Are we there yet? And then doing the metrics, as Mike talked about metrics, making sure we're meeting that. Oftentimes we try to bite off more than we can chew, and we get into a problem where we're just keep spinning because we have these limited finite resources, all these processes, and we keep going down, let's try to spread ourselves so thin. Well, we're never really going to get anywhere. So let's get some small wins, show the value to other people and the value and importance of process, and then move forward and go to the next thing, the next pot of water, so to speak.
You mean you can't eat a whole Five Guys hamburger all at once? Just shove it all in your mouth?
I can't even eat a kid's burger all at once, or even in one sitting for that matter. So yeah, no.
And I think it's interesting to talk about kind of this idea, Tom, about disruption and obviously the huge economic shifts we're going to see coming out of the whole COVID-19 thing. But I think it's interesting to think about that in the context of I think you're asking this question of is process going to be this big focus? And I think depending on how you use words like process or transformation or I don't know, kind of lean optimization, I think that often people think, or sometimes people think about kind of this two sides of a coin or two ends of the spectrum of, do you have a clear business model and a process and a value chain, and all you're doing is tuning and squeezing value out of it? And that's, very much I think Clayton Christensen talked about kind of this idea of emergent versus deliberate strategies of look, I've got a thing, it's working well, I just want to squeeze more profit and efficiency and consistency. Or is it kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, which is, man, everything needs to be kind of readdressed and reconsidered and kind of get disrupted. And so in some respect, I think process has a connotation, I think, to a lot of people of being very tactical, very focused on kind of tuning and optimizing. And I expect the next, I don't know, certainly I'm not a fortune teller, but I expect the next, 2 years is going to be much more focused on big business model disruptions and not about kind of tuning and tweaking existing kind of business models. And so I think that's much more of Beth was saying, ITIL kind of big, kind of CSI, CPI kind of transformations, really stepping back and saying, are we doing the right thing? Is this the right, concept? Should we be looking at a whole new kind of line of business or shifting dramatically as opposed to kind of tuning kind of the nuts and bolts?
So we've talked about the process, but in reality, kind of combined with what Tom said about COVID and the impacts of that, what we haven't really touched upon is the tools and technology needed to be able to implement said process. And with COVID, I think there's going to be a huge focus. People are scrambling right now, right? Putting telework processes in place that they didn't have before, and the ability to work remote. And then the focus and emphasis on, do we have the bandwidth to do so? Do we have the laptops to do so? And being able to still maintain that social aspect of interaction. Everybody's at home. That gets depressing after a while, even for us introverts. It gets a little tiresome. Believe it or not, I'm an introvert, Tom. I don't know if you knew that, but I am.
Beth, I'm with you, and people would probably not guess that I am also, but I am starting to get a little, it's a restaurant might be fun.
Right, exactly. Combine that with the big emphasis on data privacy and security. I think the probably the primary focus of any process improvement initiative is probably going to circle around that, the organizational infrastructure to be able to support more teleworking. And the other thing that's big is the interviews. We're still hiring people and having to do interviews not face to face anymore, or at least right now. Yeah. Setting up Skype, setting up Zoom meetings, etc., to be able to do that. So
I think that would be a great filter, right? If they can't deal with the interview, or can't set up Skype, or can't deal with turning on their camera, that's a hurdle in its own right that they just not surmounted.
Sure. Yeah, certainly. Well, and I feel like it also kind of brings us to this era where I feel like it used to be that we really celebrated specialists, and like that's what organizations need, was kind of this big diverse set of experts in their own like little vertical. But I feel like because it's just, I don't know, like an increasingly complex world, I just feel like you need kind of these generalists or these, versalists who can kind of, work across a lot of these different domains. Like you're talking about, Beth, with, how disruptive interviews are, how disruptive just this huge shift to telework is. It's obviously very dangerous for kind of the IT department to start kind of pushing out policies and guidance without thinking about like, well, what's the employee's experience? What's the customer's experience? Like, how does HR see this? How does, customer service work? And so I think having the people that can kind of be the glue and kind of see the bigger picture and connect is, so needed.
And can the Verizon BIOSes of the world handle the increased bandwidth that suddenly goes with that for people working from home? It's different types perhaps than versus the network that an organization actually pays for. Those are, and Mike, you bring up some good points there too as well.
It's funny. This morning as I was out jogging, I was listening to an interview with someone senior from Netflix, and the EU has asked them to turn down the bit rate in Europe because, with everybody locked up at home, they're watching tons of movies and it's clogging the pipes, so to speak. They obviously had made the correct architectural choices early on because they were able very easily to turn down the bit rate that they're using so as to back off and not lose the fidelity of the service. So there has to be some degree of fault tolerance. You're right. This is not the first time. It's like, what are the technical hurdles that we can innovate on? And is that really where we should be focusing? So it'll be interesting. I knew that it was going to be wonderful when I put you two together and got you to talk, and it has been that. We could probably go on for another hours, and I do have 8 days and 29 hours on this drive left, but I think people would probably check out, or I'd have to do a series. Before we go, if you had a magic wand, both of you have a magic wand, you wake up, you get a cup of coffee or your caffeinated beverage of choice, and you could make two things be different in terms of how people perceive process or how process is implemented, what would those two things be and why?
I think increased resources for people like me in an organization, and increased buy-in. And when I say buy-in, I mean like truly believe in this from the leadership. I think, and the two go together often. Without the buy-in or understanding of the importance of what I'm doing, I'm not necessarily getting the resources. And some of that is probably my own fault because I try to act like Wonder Woman 99% of the time, and then I fool everybody in thinking I can do everything all the time, and then I don't get the resources I need to be able to do what I need to do. So it's probably a self-fulfilling prophecy going on there. But if I had to change anything, it would be those two things. And I think that would just help facilitate me being able to touch the organization more broadly, being able to have a bigger impact around the organization. There's so many things that I want to do to help different parts of the organization become more efficient, and simply without the resources, like they don't have that. And then without the authority or the bandwidth, or I'm sorry, without the buy-in from leadership, often, what I'm doing gets dismissed in an organization. And when in reality, it is probably as important from an infrastructure perspective as the external facing customers, just to be able to facilitate their efficiencies with their customers as well.
Mr. King.
Wow. Yeah. Hard to go after that. Those were great answers. Yeah. That's amazing.
Sorry, Mike.
Yeah. I think, no, it's all right. It's all right. Yeah. Set the bar high. I respect that. Yeah. So I think one would probably be just like somehow creating, I don't know. Maybe I'd instill everybody on earth with kind of more natural curiosity about concepts and best practices outside of like their focus, right? So I think everybody kind of sees their world as like, I'm an accountant, like I'm a contracts administrator, like I'm a software developer. And I think, a lot of people have a natural curiosity of like, I want to learn how to be really good at my job. But I think a lot of people don't naturally have a curiosity of like, well, what else is out there? And so many, I think, interesting things happen when somebody starts to like study a couple of adjacent domains and starts to connect. Oh, like how does, user experience plus software developer plus really understanding, like Porter's kind of, competitive laws, kind of how does that all like fit together? And so I think that continuous learning, that kind of like looking outside of your own, kind of myopic priority would be one thing. And then I think another thing I would just, bless everybody with is a little bit more respect for kind of the bigger picture, whether that's, business strategy or process architecture or software kind of IT architecture. Because I think a lot of times organizations don't pay that a lot of respect. And certainly sometimes, teams have done that to themselves by building this reputation of being this academic kind of isolated, worldview. But I think when those teams really offer a lot of value, they connect kind of all the disparate parts of the organization in a super powerful way. So I think just more respect for kind of the big picture and, just helping people better learn and understand some of the concepts outside of their core focus.
Mike, two words come to mind when I hear you talk about that. And I think you bring up a fantastic point. And I think in this world with COVID and everything else, it's even more important. And that's compassion and empathy, and having more compassion and empathy for what each of us are doing, whether it's professionally or personally, is really going to go a long way in this world. Putting ourselves in other people's shoes, whether that's in a work environment or not, and that leaves me with my last quote that I really like, and that's to be kind because you never know what battle somebody else is fighting. And I think that kind of goes in line with what you're talking about.
No, yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's, as we are all suddenly remote, and even if we don't do this even for very long, that whole idea of compassion and empathy is critical to building trust when you can't just walk into somebody else's office. This has been everything I imagined it would be. It is everything. When I woke up at 2 this morning thinking about this interview again. Yeah, and it wasn't on purpose that I woke up at 2. This was much more than that. So this is absolutely perfect. Beth, Mike, if people wanted to continue the conversation, how would they go about doing that?
Well, they can always reach out. And are you going to do what you did before and put our contact information up on?
Oh, of course.
Then I will leave it to that, just like before. Right. I think my email and stuff was on there.
Super.
So, and of course, I'm on LinkedIn.
Certainly, I would echo that. LinkedIn and Twitter are good places. Certainly, I'll rely on those links because there's a couple of Michael Kings out there. So.
Yeah.
There's only one Beth Leonard, Mike. There's only one Beth Leonard, though. Come on.
Well, then you are lucky. There is a Tom Cagley who is a alderman in a city in California. And every once in a while, he gets my email and he gets really irritated with me.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's like, well, dude, I didn't send it to you. But regardless, at this point, open up the platform for you guys to promote anything that you like. So the platform is yours.
Well, Tom, what I'm going to talk about my blog. I have a rare cancer. It's an incurable cancer. And I have a Facebook blog. It's called Living with Neuroendocrine Cancer. So very motivational and positive, at least from my perspective, despite what I'm going through. And it's been far-reaching since we last spoke. I have almost 5,000 followers on there, and people from all over the world are reaching out to me about neuroendocrine cancer as patients or caregivers. And I hope that I've had a big impact on them, and I will continue to have a big impact on them as much as I possibly can while I'm still here. Hopefully you guys check it out.
Mike?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Well, that's certainly quite a noble endeavor. Yeah. So exciting to hear over 5,000 followers. That's great, Beth. Yeah. Yeah. From my side, I would say my big plug would just be the company I work for, Halfaker and Associates, is always hiring. We do a variety of technology services and solutions for the federal government. So we work across a lot of different domains like cloud and cyber, data science, things like that. So certainly always looking for people who are looking for a new opportunity to kind of give back and serve our government. But certainly I'd flip stomp. Beth, it sounds like your blog is awesome. I'm excited to go check that out.
Again, Beth, Mike, thank you. This really, I know we all have these incredibly wild schedules, and it was just great that we finally were able to do this.
Thank you for having me. And great. Thank you, Mike, too.
Well, of course, that was great. Great chatting with both of you. This is a great SPaMCAST.
And we read Saturday news. In Chapter 16 of Daniel Doron's and Steve Tendon's Tame Your Workflow, we chart a path to support the execution of work. Execution requires an appropriate mechanism that can signal trouble coming that is information-based rather than gut-based. The Software Process and Measurement Cast is the proud sponsor of the following events: the Women in Tech Conference. Learn, be inspired, and connect with others working to advance inclusion in the technology industry with a live at Manning event. The Women in Tech Online Conference will be held on October 13th, starring women that are rocking the tech boat. We're also sponsoring the Agile Online Summit. The Agile Online Summit was created for people who couldn't attend major conferences. This will be its third year, and the main goal is to bring major-level Agile speakers to people all over the world, as well as spotlight some up-and-coming Agile coaches and trainers. The Agile Online Summit will be October 26th through the 30th, 2020. There are links in the show notes for the Women in Tech Conference and the Agile Online Summit. Be there. The next Software Process and Measurement Cast number 619 will feature the return of Joe Schofield. Joe and I talked about his new book, Aligning People and Culture for Agile Transformation, a leadership and change story. Joe's book is not a recitation of techniques, but a business novel that exposes the human side of change. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?